The province of Alberta appears to be losing more jobs than gaining them. In fact, the seasonally adjusted unemployment rate for August was 11.8%. That's up from 7.2% in the same period of 2019. Now, the question is, how can we get more Albertans working again? To talk about this and other big stories is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me via Skype from Edmonton. Tyler, the government unveiled its investment strategy with a close to 12% unemployment rate. I guess anything will help at this point in time, including this $75 million initiative?
Yeah, so back in June, the government had announced its recovery plan, and Budget 2020 had set aside about $75 million for an investment plan, basically, is what this is. Now, in July, they made another announcement, which was this Invest Alberta Corporation, a crown corporation that's meant to be nimble and fast moving and trying to find new investment. Um, so what was announced today was a sort of expansion of that program of Invest Alberta and more broadly an investment sort of philosophy and strategy that they want to be a lot quicker, that they want to be more responsive to the needs of the private sector. And they also announced sort of as part of that a reform of intellectual property law as best the province is able. So they've promised sort of sector specific announcements in the coming weeks. And this isn't just oil and gas, this isn't just agriculture and forestry. This is aviation, this is tech, this is, you know, in some ways, if we go to the back to the always talking about diversification, this is about diversification of the economy, getting more investment. So, when will we see that pay off? They haven't given very firm timelines. I spoke with Doug Schweitzer, the innovation minister, today, and he was saying, "Look, this is our plan. You're going to see more on it, but carrying through the fall and into the new year." So, as you said, 12% unemployment, and this appears to be at least a portion of what the plan is to get people back to work.
Yeah, hopefully sooner rather than later. Tyler, the CBC recently reported that Health Minister Tyler Shandro and our province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Henshaw, are okay with a clause giving the UCP the power of mandatory vaccination. Could we actually see mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations here in Alberta?
Well, so the legislation, the Health Act, allows for the government to do so in an emergency. It dates back to like 1984 or something like that. So what Dina Hinshaw said and what Tyler Shandro, the health minister, said was they're looking at repealing that, actually taking it out of the law because they basically don't see it as useful. And Tyler Shandro had actually just put out a long Twitter thread sort of moments ago, actually, about how one of his concerns with this is that it sort of drives fears that there's going to be a mandatory vaccination campaign. He's sort of saying that this is not going to happen. We are not going to be enforcing vaccination for the COVID-19 vaccine whenever it comes along. So it's sort of to stop those fears, just sort of stop them dead. If they can remove this piece, they don't have the authority to do it. Dina Hinshaw saying she has no problem with removing it, doesn't see a benefit of it, but it's sort of a legacy bit that exists for some reason, and I'm almost positive it's never been used.
Let's talk about the job that our government is doing so far when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. You're on the inside, you're hearing what's happening when you talk to a lot of these politicians. Are we flattening the curve, and are we maybe potentially seeing a second wave?
Well, the curve is probably, I would say, less flat than everyone would like. We've seen a spike in cases in recent weeks. I think very nearly the highest rates we've seen since May or something like that. Now you look at where those outbreaks are. We haven't had sort of that I'm aware of big rounds of outbreaks in long-term care homes with the most vulnerable. But obviously there are concerns about schools. That's been the big one. The NDP, for example, has been talking about schools, constantly raising concerns about classroom sizes, physical distancing, and and we're seeing similar in other parts of the country with Quebec and Ontario and British Columbia, all sort of considering what a second wave might look like. So cases are climbing. Certainly, are people saying there's a second wave? We need another lockdown. That does not seem to be the case. The Kenney government, seems very keen on keeping the economy as open as possible, keeping things as open as possible, so that people can keep working. But as everyone's sort of watching, I mean, it's getting colder out. Flu season is coming. Winter's coming. Traditionally, a time when more people get sick. Kids are back in school. I think any parent would say that the minute their kids go back to school, everyone gets a cold of some sort. So There's a lot of moving parts, and the government, I think, is trying to tread carefully between this public health balance and then also keeping the economy going. So it's a tricky one, no doubt about
Yeah,
that.
no easy answers. You know, a lot of the small business owners I've spoken to, and even at the Chamber of Commerce's as well, they say, you know what, we don't want to see the economy shut down again because a lot of those small to medium businesses, they just cannot survive another shutdown. The province announced that it is reviewing AISH eligibility. Now, the benefit provides around $1,600 a month to the severely handicapped, Tyler. The government says it is growing faster than it ought to. Around 70,000 Albertans receive this money. Now, is the government concerned that people may be abusing the system? That's why they're reviewing?
Well, they're sort of concerned, I think, that the definition of severely handicapped has expanded, inappropriately perhaps in the last few years. Now, pretty much everyone would say there are problems with AISH. It's quite an onerous process to get on AISH. It, rewards commitment to filling out forms in some ways. Um, but it's a really interesting situation at the legislature with this right now because it sort of came out, and the first impression people had was that it was going to be cuts to benefits, so cuts to that $1,685 per month. The government said no, no, that's not what it is. It's actually reviewing eligibility. So you now have people worrying that they might lose their AISH, or people who are thinking about getting it that they might not be able to. Um, and so it's just an interesting political move. I mean, the premier saying that, look, belt tightening is happening all around. This needs to be part of it. But it I mean, I'm frankly flummoxed by it, Hal. It's a perfect open opportunity for the opposition to criticize them. Um, there are columnists who have been, supportive of the UCP have been critical of this. I mean, it really just smacks, I think, for many of the critics of taking out problems on the most vulnerable. So I confess I understand the saving money portion of this, but to be perfectly frank, it strikes me as a blunder at such a sensitive time for this government. It I've been scratching my head about it all week. Let's say that.
The UCP has committed spending around $43 million to upgrade our provincial parks, including over $10 million in Kananaskis country. That's where I learned how to horseback ride, as a matter of fact. Tyler, the government says they also plan to delist or transfer ownership of parks. What will that actually look like for the average Albertan?
Yeah, so in theory, it means that nothing should close. These are mostly small parks that they are looking at delisting. Very small parks, lots of them, accounting for a small percentage of the provincial park land. And they're basically just trying to find private operators for these things, saying the government needs to save some money and get out of the business in some of these areas. This has also been a really, really hot button issue. I was watching a Facebook Live of NDP leader Rachel Notley and noticed that she is holding a mug in her Facebook picture that says "Don't go breaking my parks." So it's yet another, again, maybe very good reasons, but it's been a bit of a political hot potato here. So great to see investments going to public parks. I mean, that keeps people working, upgrades infrastructure, many good reasons for that. But the delisting thing again has just been it's just really tickled a lot of people the wrong way. So it's we've talked about this before. I think how the Alberta government has sort of continued on governing even during the pandemic, continuing pushing its agenda through the pandemic, and it's been very interesting and very, very challenging, for better or worse, I think.
I've got that Elton John song going through my head. Don't go breaking my heart. Tyler, new polls have come out which show that Premier Jason Kenney's popularity has taken a little bit of a hit. In fact, Kenney and Notley are apparently neck and neck in the latest polls. What's causing this slide in our Premier's popularity right now?
Yeah, I think it has to do with several of the things we've just discussed. People are concerned about the economy, and Premier Jason Kenney made big promises about the economy. People are concerned about the pandemic. People are concerned about back to school. The opposition has also, in the last sort of 6 or 8 months, let's say, really found its legs. I think, they are doing a pretty good job of keeping criticism of the premier and of his government in the public. And the other thing that some of the polling in recent days has shown is that the support for the NDP is actually a little bit more solid. So you had about 93% of the people who voted NDP in the last election would vote NDP again. So they've lost, say, 7% of their support. And now the UCP is about 85%. So they've lost a little bit more. Whether or not they've gone to the NDP, whether or not they've gone to the Alberta Party, hard to say. But It is interesting that because Kenney's, I think, even started out the pandemic with quite high ratings, but no doubt it's been a very challenging time for the government, and he's taken a hit on it.
So some of the people who are not going to vote for the UCP or maybe not for the NDP is maybe the Liberal Party and David Kahn picking up some of those votes?
Yeah, who knows? I mean, as we talked about last time, maybe the Alberta Party will get around to picking a leader and find they have some more support. So, frankly, I think it's hard to say that would be a bad thing to have support trickling to some of these other parties and have a more diverse array of political opinions in the legislature.
The Heritage Trust Fund is growing again, Tyler, following losses during the pandemic. It currently sits at around $7.2 billion. That's up from $16.3 billion at the end of March. Now, that's good news considering it's been a pretty rough year for investments.
It has indeed. It's been a I had a stack of envelopes with my investments and pensions sitting around the other day that I couldn't bear to open. Had to mentally prepare myself for it. So yeah, I mean, the Heritage Fund had taken a bit of a beating. A lot of the AIMCO investments, the Alberta Investment Management Corporation, I believe, they also manage public pensions, had taken a hit in the last little while. Some sort of mistakes made and things like that. So it's good to see the Heritage Fund growing. And I mean, I think people might recall a few weeks ago a column from Calgary radio host Danielle Smith, former leader of the Wild Rose Party, saying that one of the responses to the pandemic ought to be to empty the Heritage Trust Fund to sort of carry us through this pandemic and the economic recession. Now, no indication that the government plans on doing that, but having a healthy Heritage Trust Fund, I think, is probably certainly at the front of lots of Albertans' minds, and so it's good to see it growing again.
Tyler, we talked a bit about the COVID-19 pandemic, how much it's impacted all of Canada and especially here in Alberta as well, a lot of business owners. But what about the opioid crisis? As you know, here in Lethbridge, the province pulled funding to Arches and the supervised consumption site. We've got the mobile SES right now. But how is the province getting ahead and helping those most vulnerable when it comes to drug addiction? What are you hearing?
Yeah, it's a good question. There was quite a bit of discussion in Edmonton specifically about homelessness and services being offered in the inner city. So the homelessness thing, I mean, sort of intersects with that and has been quite challenging. I believe Jason Luan who's the addictions minister, had spoken about this some weeks ago. Certainly, what the Alberta government is not doing is what British Columbia announced this week, which is that they will allow pharmacists, I believe, to prescribe or give out a safe drug supply to users. Overdose levels in Vancouver, obviously, being the highest in the country. So the government, the Alberta government, I should say, has long been on this plan for treatment, that they don't want to sort of enable drug use in any way. They want to get people into treatment and things like that. And that approach has come under a considerable amount of criticism. And as you said, the Lethbridge site being unique in some ways, I think, because of what would be the gentle word? Corruption, maybe, concerns about missing money
Misappropriation
and
of
things like that.
$1.6 million in taxpayers' funds. Yeah, that's right.
There you go. There you go.
Unaccounted
That's
for
the phrase.
cash,
So
and that's a lot of
yes,
cash we're
so
talking about here.
it is indeed. It's a complicated one, and I don't know if any government has a really good handle on it. But I mean, it's also, I think, in some ways, it's hard for a government to come out with some of these policies, some of these proposals, and at the same time as a pandemic. So it's just so many things pulling them in so many different directions.
The Alberta correspondent for the National Post and our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson, thanks for joining me today from Edmonton.
Thanks, Hal.